think we're ready to go. So I'll start with just a little info about who I am. Again, my name is Grayson Milbourne, and I've worked at Webroot, geez, almost 16 years now. I spent much of my time at the company as a reverse engineer, malware analyst, and threat intelligence extractor, so to speak. And these last few years, I've spent more time on the product side, focusing on thought leadership and ensuring efficacy within our products. So a lot of the content in today's presentation actually comes from our own threat research team. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the working from home dynamic and how that's different from remote work. I'm going to share several examples of how COVID has impacted cybersecurity. I'm going to talk a little bit about how a layered approach to security is an effective strategy. And then again, of course, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about Q&A. So let's go ahead and get started here. Okay, there we go. So I want to first start talking a little bit about the challenges that companies face, especially MSPs, in supporting this rapid shift from a remote workforce or partially remote workforce to a working from home workforce. And I think one of the big trends that we've seen is that people who work from home are much more likely to use their personal devices compared to a corporate issued device. And this is a big challenge because managed devices that are much more easy to control and regulate and enforce, like policy settings and updates and all those good things, certainly don't exist on personal devices. And beyond that, we see that personal devices are often used by more than one user. And in most cases, these are all local admin accounts. And so you can pretty much do what you like on those systems. And then we also know that people typically use their home PCs a little bit different than they use their work PCs. We also know that the network at home is definitely less secure, and how familiar people are with their router and those settings is much less likely to be up to speed with good security practices when compared to a corporate environment. So let's look at these a little closer. When we look at PCs with multiple users, we know they're less secure. And we know this because of how Webroot's threat intelligence is collected from the devices that we protect, and that we see that consumer devices see nearly twice as many infections compared to business devices. And again, this kind of comes down to how we use our devices and how secure we keep them. But again, especially with families with kids, it's very common to have even just one account used by multiple people instead of even having just separate accounts for each individual. And these things all add up to a more risky environment. So, to help combat this, we always suggest using managed devices through the MSP, but we know that's not always possible. And one thing that can certainly help in this scenario here is just some education, having alerting employees that, if you want to maybe use a personal device at home, allow us to install some remote management software on it and make sure that we have security up to date and make sure that we have the system itself up to date and Windows is up to date and the browser and common applications are updated. By doing those things, you go a long way in reducing the attack surface, even of a home personal device. But certainly another big challenge is the network side of things. And, when we look at home networks, they're often much less secure than even remote working networks. So things like a hotel or your mobile network or an airport Wi-Fi or something like that likely still has better security in place than your home network that in many cases is using a rented router from your broadband provider, or in some cases people purchase these things. But the challenge is most people plug it in, it works, and then they never log in to see, hey, is the default admin account still there? Have I updated passwords? Like, are the settings proper? And particularly with home routers, firmware is typically not kept up to date. And the good news here is that routers today, if you go out and buy a new one today, it's very likely that the OS of the router actually has an option for automatic updates, which is a really great thing. And when we looked at some of the more sophisticated attacks over the past couple of years, attacks on routers are really popular because if you can control that gateway to the internet, you can do a lot of nasty things. You can do redirects, you can inject crypto mining scripts. It's a very sensitive piece of hardware that needs to be understood. And so one of the things we also advocate for is that users need to not be so afraid of their router, right? They need to figure out how to run ipconfig and log into that router and see what the password is. And if it is default, change that password. And if your router's firmware is not updatable, maybe it's time to consider updating that to modernize your home network, since working from home is likely to be a trend to continue for quite some time. The last thing I'll mention here is that a VPN is always also something that we highly recommend. And not just like a VPN to get onto your corporate network or to maybe remote desktop into a corporate device, but that VPN needs to certainly be protected with two-factor authentication. And one of the mistakes I see often with two-factor authentication initial setup is that the second factor of authentication, that PIN, that needs to be on a mobile device, not on the actual PC that you're using. For example, like if I'm on my work home PC and I VPN in and then I have a token generator that's also on that same PC, sort of defeating the fact of why 2FA is beneficial. Because if, say, my PC were infected and I had a remote monitoring tool on there, they could very easily not only just capture my credentials to log into the network, but the second factor PIN would be very easy for them to discover as well. So device separation is really important when thinking about 2FA. And personally, I think mobile phones are really the ideal solution for where you should store that 2FA PIN. So let's talk a little bit about some of the shifts that we've really seen with COVID and working from home. And one of the big ones is remote desktop protocols prevalence. And some of this data came here from Shodan.io, which is it's kind of like a Google or a search engine that shows internet connected devices globally. And it just within it, you can search for TCP 3389, which is basically the default RDP port. This could be completely changed, but by default, this is what it's set to. And these are ones that are just openly active speaking to the internet. And so this is like RDP not behind a VPN, perhaps. And this is a big challenge because RDP is not the most secure protocol. There are many things about it that make it very easy to break into. Again, lots of times people have very weak passwords, and if exposed, by default doesn't have a lockout if too many attempts or too many failed attempts happen. So brute forcing through RDP is pretty common. And also what we see is that once somebody gets their foothold inside of a network through RDP, it can definitely be a lot easier for them to then understand what security measures are in place and basically could do some reconnaissance before they would then maybe deliver a ransomware payload as one example. So RDP is certainly something that we've seen continue to go up. And so, if businesses need to use it, it's a very important and useful functionality, but it needs to be secured properly, which with 2FA and behind a VPN is something that you can absolutely do. Beyond that, I would recommend maybe moving off of default ports and also having some access controls so that if a user does fail to log in over several attempts, that the account is then locked. But things like that and having visibility into RDP access can be a great way to discover a possible breach. So I now have like several slides that I wanted to talk about that kind of just show how cyber criminals have weaponized COVID-19 information. And it's no new shocking trend or anything like this that cyber criminals are looking at what's relevant in the mass media and leeching onto that and leveraging that to trick their users or trick their victims, I should say. And so a couple here that we have is on the left here with the Johns Hopkins University coronavirus global map. I think most people are familiar with this, but we've seen clones of this and sites that if you went and Googled for this, it's likely in the top 20 results or so that you would stumble across a not reputable version. And again, the goals here sometimes, depends on who's really behind it. But, we've seen examples that, just lead to misinformation and trying to confuse or mislead people. But we also see these sites trying to elicit credit card information and support and, for vaccines and just donations, which often can also turn out to be malicious. And so on the right here, we basically have some charity scam that, again, is, they try to look legitimate and they are full of links that take you to illegitimate sites. So this is just one example that, again, we see people's interest in what's going on with COVID being manipulated to collect personal information, credit card numbers and passwords and things of that nature. We also see lots of industry-based scams. So this one here is a Netflix free during quarantine scam, which Netflix may have done at some point, but this particular one was also was certainly malicious. And you can see just by the domain name here, using that Netflix-USA.net, oddly enough, will trick a lot of people. So again, just trying to take advantage of COVID through free offers that a lot of companies maybe expanded their trials or have done things to make life a little easier as we go through this pandemic. Cyber criminals look at that and take advantage of it in a similar way. And this is just one example with Netflix, but we've seen the same things for all the various streaming services. And in fact, we actually saw the very largest spike in YouTube phishing. And YouTube, as a company that's owned by Google, your credentials for your YouTube account are the same for your Gmail account. And your primary email account is sort of like the holy grail for cyber criminals. If you compromise an email account, you can then see what other accounts exist. And then if you reset a password, well, that comes back to that email, and pretty quickly a skilled hacker could compromise most of your accounts after breaching your initial email address. So this one made me laugh. So this example here is a fake antivirus that's talking about, it's the Corona antivirus, not like a vaccine, but more like a security product. And I think this is funny just because, as I mentioned, I've been working with malware for a very long time, and I remember back in like 2006, 2007 era. Fake anti-malware programs were sort of they were a big family of malware. And people just were beginning to know, like, oh yes, I need to have something installed, but they weren't that familiar with the various major brands. And what often happened is they would get infected with something that called it total AV, or some fake AV that would scan and say, hey, look how infected you are, but you got to pay $50 to remove all of these infections. And sadly, that those nicer at the time types of infections were replaced with the ransomware that we face today. But seeing an example that kind of spoofed off of COVID for an antivirus, certainly brought back some old memories. But again, just an example of how the creativity of cyber criminals really has no bounds when leeching onto major news events like Corona. So this one is on the mobile side, and we've seen several examples like this, that they're basically information stealers. But this is trying to tell you that, they have an index, a registry of people who have been infected with COVID, and you can have this app and it'll track your GPS and it'll show you if you're close, but you got to pay for it. And again, kind of a silly thing, but we found this this APK floating out in the wild. So still people are thinking, how can they maybe use mobile as a different vector? And in that scope, we've certainly seen a very large increase in the number of SMS-based phishing attempts. And in the United States, we had a stimulus package, and so that was leveraged, and there were lots of SMS and email spam attacks that tried to get users to click on bad links and submit bad information. And similarly, in the United States, we do our census every 10 years. That's this year here, and so we've also seen a lot of census related scams going around as well. And then again, we have like spam itself, and email as a vector for infection. And there's no doubt that this remains one of the number one ways that people willingly install malware onto their systems. And again, we see the major players here. So like in this case, this is the Emotet Trojan, which is extremely prevalent and oftentimes used as a gateway for additional infections, whether that's like TrickBot or other ransomware. We see though this particular infection largely distributes itself through email. And what we see is like they've definitely jumped into using COVID-related information as their lure, so to speak. But again, you can see oftentimes what we see in these emails is that there's email filters out there that are designed to try to stop this kind of spam. And so they're familiar with those filters too. And so they craft their emails with slight misspellings and word organization that and sometimes trips up those spam filters, and these emails end up getting into an inbox. And then beyond that, they almost always have an attachment. And the attachments we've seen kind of shift, over the past few years, but the flavor that they've been using for now has been Office Word documents that have macros enabled. And they will use different lures for how to get you to click on enable the content, because in most cases, by default, running macros is not enabled by default, and the user has to click to enable that content. But we see lots of, again, different social engineering techniques here to say that, maybe this document is of the mobile version only, or, you have the wrong version of Word, and you need to click this to update. And you'd be surprised again that people click on these things. And again, like once you click on this, it runs a macro, some code basically within that document. And in almost all cases, we see that code opens up PowerShell and runs a PowerShell script to download, or PowerShell command to download the file from the internet and execute it, which basically is then installing that emotet infection, which again then harvests emails from that system, tries to move laterally through the network and gain information and a foothold into that new environment. And then, of course, all those emails that it harvests, well, guess what? They get very similar looking emails to this one that you see on the screen here. So again, like just another good example of how far some of the cybercriminals will go to make things look legitimate. So this particular example here was an email that was saying that this is a White House like press release that has new guidelines for how to combat COVID in the United States. And if you click on this link, it takes you to another page that looks very legitimate. It's coronavirus guidelines, and then it has a download and read the full document. And of course, if you click on download and read the full document, you end up getting a Word document that wants you to enable the macro. and as the previous slide showed, that's exactly where you don't want to go. But again, the look and feel of these things and the links that you see on these pages all work. It's it's really, they're just trying to get you to click on that big red button. So again, kind of an interesting example of what that looks like. And then this example here is kind of just from our own threat intelligence and our back-end threat research environment. But we just looked for file names that contain corona or virus, and we found lots of different examples of malware that just even using this name. And so I gave some examples of emotet, but there are lots of other malware out there that also distribute themselves through email. And oftentimes we see oftentimes what we'll see here is using corona in the file name itself. And so you can see one here has like a docx.exe, where again, by default in Windows, they hide the extensions for known extension types, which can be very misleading for a user if they look at a file that looks like a .faq or a .doc, but it's actually a .executable. We see this type of misinformation or trickery going on as well. So another common one, and trust me, we're using Zoom today, and our Zoom session here is totally safe. But Zoom also blew up right off the bat with working from home and Zoom being a free platform. And certainly we all have now had to become familiar with various remote meeting platforms. And I think it's important to understand how each of them work and the security features that exist for them. But in the Zoom bomb attack, basically what happened here is, for like a Zoom meeting, you receive an email, you click on the link, and it launches into the Zoom environment. And what the hackers did in this case is that they sent out some spam emails that replicated or mimicked what Zoom does. And so when you would click on that link, it would further the illusion that you got what you expected, because the Zoom installer would actually run, but they bound to that installer, in this particular case a crypto miner. So you would install Zoom, but you also happen to get a crypto miner. And then of course there was like no meeting on the back side of this thing, so it was, I don't know, like it was an interesting example of an attack that we saw. But I think the good news here is that now that we're several months into this pandemic and working from home, Zoom and many of the other remote meeting platforms have really beefed up their security. But that said, I think being familiar with the platform that you're using and reviewing its security features and using which ones are necessary for your meeting is definitely something that I would recommend. So now I want to talk just a little bit more about some of the trends we saw, again, related to, and this is coming from Webroot's own data, again, where we look at data that's coming from our endpoints, real world infections, and things of that nature. But we also saw, like on our website of threat intelligence, there are lots and lots of new websites being registered that either have like COVID or coronavirus as part of the domain name. And a lot of these are actually malicious. And now it's not like a very high percentage, but over 2% of the 20,000 we detected between March and April were malicious. And I wasn't able to get, unfortunately, the latest numbers on this, but it's definitely something that I know we continue to see a very elevated rate of new domain registrations using a bit much bigger word list than just COVID or coronavirus, but things like Max and vaccine and other health-related things. And again, we expect to see cybercriminals taking advantage of that. And as I showed on a couple slides before, right, the Zoom cloud meeting.executable is, again, it's legitimate when it's coming from the right source, but, we also saw lots and lots of examples of Zoom, for example. We saw a 2,000% increase in file names using Zoom that were malicious. So again, cybercriminals look at that and they say, hey, people are using this, we're going to do the same thing and try to trick whoever we can. Right here on the domain name side of things, this is just the total number of new domain names being registered. And so you can see, and again, this data kind of goes back to March, April, right when work from home was largely being rolled out for everyone. But almost immediately we saw, more than 1,000 per day of websites being registered with the name COVID. It makes you wonder that, yes, there's a lot of great things going on and people wanting to help and be supportive, but cybercriminal activity certainly lurks within a lot of that new registration. But there is some good news, right? So I guess like on the positive side of things here, there is a COVID-19 cyber threat coalition. It's not, I would say, very well supported. Webroot has contributed some data to this, but largely they have a blacklist that we've been contributing to and consuming that looks at some of these websites and domains that have been registered that are malicious. And so it's good to see industry come together and work together. I think having worked in this industry for as long as I have, I think one of the big challenges is that cyber criminals are very good at working together, and cybercrime as a service and just the availability of support and assistance for pretty much all types of cybercrime is readily available and surprisingly inexpensive. And then we have our for-profit cybersecurity companies, of course, which Webroot is one of. But our goal is still to protect our customers, but we need to work better together. And there are lots of good things outside of this COVID-19 a coalition here, as far as threat intelligence sharing. But I'm always advocating for better threat intelligence sharing amongst cybersecurity vendors. In any event, this is a good example, and I was happy to come across this and to contribute some as well. So protecting remote workers. I know we've talked a lot about the different types of scams that we've seen, but there's definitely some things that are effective solutions to combating things like routers getting compromised, for example. And so let's just talk about that problem in itself, right? So working from home, one of the big problems is DNS, and DNS is like it's old as the internet, and it's clear text. There's no that information is known to your internet service provider. And in a traditional, setup, if you're off the VPN and you're requesting the IP address of a domain, the internet service provider is the one who's going to reply back to you with that information. And that gives them a lot of visibility into your address book, so to speak. So, unless you're using like Tor or you're on a VPN, all of your internet traffic is known at least to them. And how they use that information is, I guess it just depends on who your internet service provider is. But it causes us to, not have as much control over internet request data that we might want to have. The other thing is like in this case here, things are going through that router and through that router to your ISP. And so if your router has been compromised, again, you have another point in which compromise could occur. And so one of the things that, Webroot has released this product, at least in our last couple of years, is what we call DNS Protection. And one of the nice things about DNS Protection is that we control the address book. And so, you only have to trust what we do with that data, which we don't do anything with it. But we actually protect that data stream. And so what's nice about DNS Protection is that there's several things. Like one is we use what we call DNS over HTTPS. And so instead of having that clear text visible for everybody request, we make that same request to our own DNS servers, but we're doing it over HTTPS from an application as opposed to going through a router. And that greatly improves, what we're able to do with that data as it comes back. So one of the strengths that Webroot has had is our machine learning and threat intelligence awareness on the web, and our ability to classify different content types on the web. And so malware and malicious sites and phishing sites are certainly part of the bad, but we also have different content like social media, sports or news, or there's 82 different categories. And so one of the benefits of DNS is also that, or DNS protection, is that you can apply policy-based settings to the internet. So if you want workers not visiting social media during certain hours, it's very easy to set up a policy that says no social media. Now, how this applies to those work from home employees is that DNS protection is just a piece of software that is installed. And so, again, we would always advocate for using managed devices. But not all businesses maybe have the resources to do that, or in some cases, employees might be asking to say, "Hey, can I use my personal device?" And maybe it's my device, but please manage it a little bit for me. DNS protection is one of those things that goes a long way in improving that network security posture for for a home device. So we're excited kind of about how we can improve DNS, and certainly through protecting the data that comes back, that's great. The other benefit to this is with malware. So, threats are obviously the thing that we want to prevent. And again, you kind of have to have a layered approach to do this successfully. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. But there's an example of where if malware tries to get onto your box, let's just go with that Emotet example because it's such a prevalent infection out there. If Emotet, say like your user makes a mistake and opens up that Word document, and then they make a second mistake and they enable the macros. When that Emotet infection then runs that macro and opens up PowerShell to try to download malware, well, it's going to have to use our DNS protection agent to go and get that address and figure out, where's that coming from. And if we're familiar with that and know, we're obviously not going to allow that download to occur. So it's just another great way that you can, improve and protect a system at like an earliest point. And so if we can prevent an infection getting onto the system, that's much better than relying on endpoint antivirus to detect an infection as it's dropped. So our data shows that it's actually quite effective at preventing these type of multi-staged infections that start with a little bit of social engineering and ultimately lead to some new code running on that machine. So just another like highlight slide for DNS protection, but right, we block malicious sites, malicious phishing sites, high risk domains. Super easy to set up, like it quite literally can just be pushed down either through our endpoint agent or it can be installed by itself. And it just gives you visibility, right? And it also protects your visibility as well. So like you'll have the visibility into what your users who are using DNS protection are accessing in the websites that they're visiting. But nobody else will. Because of DNS over HTTPS, we control that. And so that visibility is kept private. So that's how DNS security works. I always throw in one slide about AI and ML, and I'm sure most of the people on this call have these things cleared up, but I can't tell you that I haven't gone to a conference and heard somebody speak improperly. So just again, artificial intelligence is the high umbrella. Any automated task in place of a human, something we've been using machines to do for as long as we've had computers around. Machine learning is like kind of the first nested bubble within that, in that improving a machine's ability to do something for like a task that humans just say could do, but a machine could do it a lot faster. And then finally, deep learning is training computers to think how humans think, and being able to analyze complex data sets to extract out the meaningful information. And this is really where in cybersecurity, deep learning and neural networks can do things so much quicker than humans can. And really, when we come down to cybersecurity today, it's a big data problem. And if you knew a URL was malicious, well, you wouldn't click on it. And if you knew that file was bad, you wouldn't open it. And so it's a time of need intelligence problem. And with the scale of things and how much data that we generate on a daily basis, it's a big challenge. And deep learning and neural networks are a great tool, but the reality is we also see these things used by malware authors as well. And so we'll see lots of examples in the last couple of years of adversarial ML and AI, which again, it's cat and mouse game, and it will continue to be. This just speeds up, I think, the rate at which new data can be analyzed and processed. So it's a good thing overall for sure. Cool. So this brings me to probably my media slide, and I really like this slide because this is really how Webroot has thought about protecting users, all the way down to the data on the device. And it's a layered approach. And the reality is, and I think we should all know this, is that cybersecurity isn't being effective at just one thing. And there's no way to be 100% effective at any one thing either. And so really what you need is a layered approach where if something gets past one layer, there's a chance that a next layer could target or identify that threat. And so just kind of go through this here. Users are like the first layer of defense, right? They're your employees. They're the people who, are most likely to be the target of exploitation through social engineering or being tricked into opening something or maybe just making a silly mistake. But user education can go so far in really helping people understand. I'll talk a little bit more about Webroot's user education system, but I know Atera has as well. The overall point is like you should be educating your users to be aware of cybersecurity threats. There's lots of industry standard regulated trainings, yet there's not really as much for cybersecurity awareness and understanding and knowing how threats work and what those emails look like and being able to also test your employees and send out a fake internal phishing campaign to identify people who might need additional training are all really good things that we can do that are really inexpensive that can prevent these more costly later stage discoveries of a threat. DNS protection, after users, now we're talking about the internet. So DNS protection is kind of like the highest level to prevent and protect internet traffic. And as I explained in the past few slides, it comes with a lot of flexibility to control the content type that comes through, as well as preventing malware from coming in that might need to download itself. Malicious URL blocking, right? So, our product provides an extension for the various browsers that does a couple of things. One is it prevents you from going to a malicious website, but it also does something we call search engine annotation. So when you search for something on Google or whatever search engine, malware authors are very good at search engine optimization or SEO. And what that does is it allows when someone says, COVID charity near me or something, they have crafted their websites to exploit that search engine's optimization routine, and they will get themselves often not like maybe the top 5 results, but they'll be in like 6 through 20. And so what this does is it pre-processes that site so that and it puts a little icon next to the URL to say, hey, this is a trustworthy site that we are familiar with. It's been around for a long time, and based on our understanding of it, it's safe. Versus something that's maybe brand new and we've never even seen it before because it was just registered the day before. And maybe we don't know that it's malicious, but we can say, hey, this is a 0-day site and it's highly suspicious. So, click at your own risk. So again, like trying to improve user awareness of where threats and risks exist is something that we think has been very important to our success. Of course, then we have like web exploit prevention, though these types of attacks are far less common today, largely because the browsers themselves have done a great job of really improving their exploitability, and through bug bounty programs and events at DEF CON and things of that nature, web browsers are much better than they've ever been. That said, we still see old systems out there running old versions of the various browsers, and so it's still an element within our product. And then, of course, we have malicious scripts. And so, in the case of that emotet document, if you're running our endpoint product, we would have detected the document as malicious. But that said, these things are shifting always. And so it's one of these things that, you need to have visibility into how scripts are running on an endpoint. And particularly when we think about scripts, there's one family that we call living off the land binaries, or lol bins. And these are things like PowerShell or WScript or RunDLL. There are several others. There's actually dozens of these, but they're core components to Windows that most can be scripted. And can do dangerous things. And so without proper visibility into the various lol bins that exist and how they can be used and what's being executed through them, you lose visibility into how a system can be compromised without any new code being on that system. Script is something that we've added in the last year that we're proud of and have good visibility into. And then of course we come down to the actual malware. So in some cases, we get through all of these layers, and now we have that new application that's malicious trying to write itself to the operating system. And so at that point, again, now we've seen the file, and we have great threat intelligence in a this perpetual cycle process that we use to discover, classify, and defend against new threats. And so there's a very good chance here that we would see the file at the write on disk. But of course, sometimes, in the very rare cases, we still see things that get past the initial lookup. And so at that point, we kind of look to see what happens during execution. And at this point, it's kind of like, okay, we failed at blocking it, but now we can at least try to stop it while it executes and get to that detection as fast as possible. And so the way we do this is not entirely unique in the industry, but we have some things that are quite unique to us. But we kind of watch execution. And so, malware oftentimes, if it's on a limited user account, needs to gain privileges. It wants to get administrative rights. And so there's several ways that we see applications try to exploit the system to achieve that. By doing those things, you kind of you show yourself, you show your true colors, and we can detect based on that. There are several other heuristics that kind of look at how is execution happening, what's being touched during execution. And one of these such things is our identity shield, which is basically a layer of technology that tries to prevent executing malware from accessing sensitive information. And so one of the biggest areas that we see that is within the browser. So this layer of technology, amongst other things, protects the web browser so that malware can't interfere with the browser's memory space. And then finally, we get down to detection. And so with Webroot's product, the endpoints are the eyes and the ears of our threat intelligence discovery process. And so we literally have visibility into every application that's seen on every endpoint. And so malware, does uses techniques like polymorphism as one example to try to make itself very unique with each deployment, with the goal of evading detection, so that if they can avoid being seen by a threat researcher at one of the various AV companies, their threat's going to go unknown for a long time. And I've seen lots of examples of this where we've seen infections that have been in a network for over 3 months, with an incumbent AV completely blind still to the fact that there was some malicious code running. And so our goal here is to basically, we know it's a perpetual cycle. New malware is going to be generated, users are going to be dumb, and things are going to break through these layers. And what we need to do is be as fast as possible at discovering these things and protecting everybody else. And so one of our metrics internally that we track with this is what we call time to detection. And so this is saying, yes, there's a percentage of files that we block or we prevent any execution from, but there's also a subset of files that do execute that we eventually discover to be malicious. And the metric I'm most proud of in the work that I've done here is that we look across at that number across the board, we get through about 80% in under 30 minutes of the net new malware that we allowed to execute. So yes, it may have been able to execute, but the window is very, very small between that initial execution and its discovery, and then of course everybody else is protected in a cloud-based solution. Of course, then there's the last layer, right? So I mean, sometimes that's still not enough, and having a backup solution is also something we always advocate for, and not just backup that's a local backup, but backup that's also air-gapped. You never know; it might not be malware; it could be natural disaster, and so having extra copies is always, the best insurance policy. So that's a lot of time I know on this one slide, but I think it's important to just talk a little bit about why we built our product the way we did, and how a layered approach has been a very successful strategy for our customers. So I only have a couple more slides here, and then I'm going to jump to Q&A. So I appreciate your patience through all these slides so far. But again, just Webroot's security awareness training. I had one slide on this just talking about what it provides, but in general, I think user training is something that all MSPs should be considering for their customers. Certainly phishing simulation, since phishing just continues to be and isn't going to go away, a very effective measure for collecting credentials. So being able to test your employees with these things on a regular basis really goes far. And so especially with phishing simulations, we create new templates for these constantly. And just as an example, since COVID, we've created over 25 COVID-related simulations that are all taken from the wild. So, when we scrape through our honeypots and spam feeds and these things, we see the real world examples of these attacks. And we then take them and we create training tools out of them so that you can literally use the same the same look and feel of what's going on in the wild against your employees in a controlled way to help educate them about what the attacks look like, because the attacks and what they look like are constantly shifting. As an example, as we get closer to the end of this year, and every year we see the exact same trend occur, which is open enrollment for health insurance, and so we will see spam that really just tries to lure in on that. And so again, just having preparedness for that can go a long way in preventing an employee from making a bad mistake. We also do reporting and compliance. It's what we're kind of calling our virtual CISO course, but it allows you to distribute out various compliance things like PCI or HIPAA. Yeah, again, it's all designed to be easy to manage. It's all a single pane of glass. Like all of the consoles are integrated into one pane of glass. And so whether it's DNS protection or security awareness training or endpoint, all easy to manage. So that'll bring me to my last kind of slide here. Again, just a little last talk about Webroot and what we do, but this is kind of our business in that we have our endpoint product that's something we brought to market back in 2010, and really at the time it was way before nextgen even was a term. But as nextgen kind of became more mainstream by 2013, 14, 15, they were calling themselves things that we had been doing for several years. So we've been focused on ML and a cloud-based approach and a community-based approach, and it's actually been very effective. DNS protection is the web filtering side that's kind of beyond what we can do in the browser. So the endpoint protection protects the browser itself, but if you want to protect the entire network stack on a device, so anything that connects outbound or it comes in, DNS protection is definitely what is why we have that. Also to support content filtration and to allow some policy control around content type, and then training our users. And I think, again, I'm really excited about user awareness training because people should be informed about these things. And especially as we consider a work from home environment for the next foreseeable future, staying informed is really an important thing to do. And then lastly, right, we're a threat intelligence company, and we basically leverage what we collect through our various endpoints and OEM relationships as part of our perpetual cycle of discovery. So that's a bit about Webroot. I want to go ahead and jump now to the question slide here and see if you guys have any questions. And so I see I have one that's come in here asking about how support for Webroot is managed. And that's actually a great question. And so Webroot actually does all of their own support. So as an MSP, if you are selling Webroot and you have a customer who has, say, maybe like they're concerned that they're infected with malware, they would then work with our support teams, and all of our support is free of charge. We have both phone and email-based support. We have teams in the United States and also in Ireland that support that. And overall, I mean, we care about customer success and happiness at a very great degree. And I don't have our most recent Net Promoter scores, but our Net Promoter score has always been, very, very high, like in the 50s, which for an AV company, most AV companies are around flat or negative. But we do a great job with support. And again, it's all free of charge and something that's managed on Webroot's side. I believe the slides are going to be shared at the end of this. I believe, let me see here. Yeah, there will be a summary of the recording sent out tomorrow. So if you're curious for that, that will be coming. So let me see here, another question came in. So Webroot journaling. So customers asked about, and I didn't really talk specifically about this, so I'm glad that you brought it up, but one of the ways that our product works with remediation is that each endpoint is specifically and uniquely aware of its state. And so what that means is when you install WSA or Webroot Secure Anywhere, the first thing that we do is we scan the file system to understand what applications exist on that system. And unlike lots of our competition, we care about classification for for good and for bad. And this also fits into how our journaling works, is that when we scan a new system, most of the time, a new system isn't going to have a lot of new files that we've not seen between our tens of millions of customers that are globally dispersed. But what we're going to likely see is that a high percentage of files are known, and because they're known, we trust them and they're free to execute without our interference. This is almost true for every good process. There are some good processes that we also still monitor because they're frequently targeted and exploited by malware. But ultimately, we now have a good picture of what's known versus what's not. And so if we see something execute that we can't validate its state and we say it's an unknown, we inject alongside that execution and we monitor what takes place. And through that monitoring, we look for things like exploitation. So maybe it's trying to boost privileges. That would be a behavior that we would key in on for detection, but maybe it's just doing some other things and we're not sure yet. And malware can do all sorts of different things. Like sometimes it sleeps for 3 days and does nothing. But we will watch and see like what happens. And so if it creates like a file system event or a registry system event or a network event, all of those things are recorded through our monitoring of that execution, and that data flows up into our cloud as well, where it's also used for our classification. But it also is a local journal, so that, for example, if it's a new piece of malware that wrote a copy of itself, and maybe it's a keylogger and it has some storage files of the data and screenshots and keylogs it's recorded, we would correlate all of those things together so that when a researcher then maybe looks at this data, within that 30-minute window and says, hey, this is something new that we've not seen before, but I can tell by what it's doing, it's definitely malicious. Okay, let's create a new detection routine. So we're going to get the variants that are like this. And then, oh, by the way, the endpoint that reported this information, it now knows that that thing that it was asking about is it was unknown is now malicious, and it has that local journal to say, here's the specific actions that it did. So from a remediation perspective, remediation is very, very effective in using this model because it's specific to the endpoint that's infected, which compared to traditional models of analyzing the malware and understanding how it can infect and then building remediation based on that is much less effective because it's pretty easy to be dynamic in your infection routine. So that's a bit more about how journaling and rollback works. And so, yes, I mean, does it actually work? I'm not going to lie and say it's a perfect technology. There are certain caveats to this and how it is capable of working. But it's very effective against most infections. It does a very good job of remediating all the component pieces. So another question came in about DNS protection, and is it the same with web protection? For example, web protection for RMM of SolarWinds. So I want to understand this question. Our DNS protection threat intelligence is the same that backs our web protection that's in our endpoint product. So it's the endpoint product only uses the real-time anti-phishing and the URL content or the URL reputation. So if it's a bad website, like we will block you from going there, and those reputation scores are what we use for search engine annotation. But with DNS protection, you get also the content categories. So if it's like social media or news, or there's 82 different categories that we allow you to control content type and time. So they're basically built. They're backed on the same type of threat intelligence. So another question came in around EDR and how we're pivoting towards that. And so Webroot is next gen in the respect that we were the first vendor to move fully away from any sort of definition-based system. So we're all cloud, and also we're next gen in how we consider our data. In that it's not just what's bad, right? It's we want full awareness, and having a community-based approach to having visibility into every specific endpoint that we protect is again something that not even all vendors today are capable of doing. And this is super important again when we look at what malware and how threats are designed to be unique to each endpoint that they infect. And in fact, we look at this across all infections. And when we look at how often when we see an infection, is it only ever seen on that one device by its SHA-256, which should be unique to that file, and any modification make a change. Over 95% of the time, the file is unique to that endpoint, and we never see the exact same file elsewhere, over 95% of the time. So, what this says is like, if you don't have that visibility into any one file being different on any one custom machine, you don't have the necessary visibility to be completely effective. And so that's another way in which I've seen nextgen be used. But again, these are things that Webroot started doing in 2010, and here we are a decade later, and all we've done is refine and improve and capture more relevant data, use better ML, use cloud more effectively. And then the other things that make us nextgen is how we handle remediation and having a journaling and rollback. And these are all really innovative ideas that still we don't see in many of the products that are out in the market. And now with respect to EDR, WSA is not an EDR product, but Webroot, which is now owned by a company called Carbonite, that was bought by a company called OpenText. OpenText does have an EDR branch. It's called Ncase. It's by Guidance. They acquired Guidance, I think in 2018. And in any event, Guidance has a great EDR. And so we've been already talking with that team and are understanding where technology overlaps. But ultimately, Guidance is going to, or Ncase is going to be part of MITRE attacks next framework report. The testing actually begins in October. Report will be released in January, but we're very optimistic that we're going to have 100% coverage for what's in MITRE. So that's what I can tell you about our future with EDR. Let me see here. So maybe a feature request about alerts when users click on suspect links. So the current console will show you if somebody clicks on a link that was blocked. So if, for example, our real-time threat, our real-time anti-phishing, the way that technology works is it's like just in time. So as the web page renders, we see what renders. We have a cloud ML service that we send feature vector data to. And this is super important for phishing sites because phishing sites are typically what we call unidirectionally linked, meaning that that URL to that fake site is only in the email that you received. And so unless I can see your email, like every new email is going to have a different URL. And so it makes it very challenging to proactively crawl to discover these types of sites. So the idea is that when you click on a site and it renders the page, that's the point of where we can make the determination during the rendering. So if that happens and a user say goes to a phishing page that we block, that would show up in your console. And so you would have a, it would be reported as that endpoint encountered that site. And the same thing would go for anything else that we would block as far as like a malicious site that's blocked. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm sorry if I missed that on a little bit, but it is definitely reported. I think maybe on suspect links, maybe that's something that's, not something we block, but has a low reputation. This is certainly something we could look to expose the reputation of a URL within the console. I'll bring it up to the product management team and get their thoughts, but I appreciate the question. So another great question, I love getting this one. You talked about layered protection. Can Webroot run on the same PC with other AV software? And this is, again, something that makes us next gen. And the answer is yes. We do not compete with other AVs and how we sit on the stack. Basically, we will act last. So if there's another AV, we give them preference over the file system. So that all that means, though, is that if we see something, they already had a chance to see it. And we see this all the time. So, within our threat intelligence network, one piece of metadata we collect is, are we installed alongside another AV, or who else is registered within Microsoft Security Center? And then we also validate that if there is somebody else there, that it's an active, up-to-date installation. It's not, out of date or disabled. And every day we see malware come across endpoints that have one of our competitors on there. And you know what? I'm sure that the inverse is also true. But the reality of this is that we do not conflict, right? Like you could not run ESET and Bitdefender side by side with Kaspersky, for example, right? Like, but you could run WSA with any one of those AVs. And again, I think that's a good thing, right? Like, why should you be limited to just one security product? Sometimes there are slight benefits in between products, and we've always wanted to support integration with any other or support running alongside any other product. And so that includes things like Malwarebytes and other products I've certainly seen try to say that we're not compatible. And when you try to install them, they will scan the system and say, "Oh, you have Webroot, you have to uninstall it." But in our experience, that's just a warning. If you install anyways, it doesn't cause any conflict. So let me just get through some more of these questions. Appreciate your patience while I read here. Right, so I guess since it's called out in the Q&A, journaling and rollback for ransomware, it does work against certain ransomware given certain situations, but we've never said it's an anti-ransomware data backup recovery solution. This is why, again, I think it's certainly important to have data backup in place. But some ransomware we can. It all really depends on what the ransomware is encrypting and how many files and how much file system you have, and it's a complicated thing. So let me just check my time here. Okay, I have about 4 more minutes, which has been great. Actually, I'm super thrilled, I have to say, getting this many questions. A lot of times I'll give similar content and people are like, okay, cool, and don't ask anything. So thanks for all the great questions, but I think I only have time for about 1 or 2 more. So let me just read through what's been put up here, and I'm going to go for the best ones. Okay, so one here asks about our footprint performance, and so performance also one thing that we really took seriously when we built this product, and albeit it's a little bit larger now, but our initial release was under 1 megabyte, and this is because we built it. We don't use third-party libraries. It's written in straight C. It's as lightweight as it can be without compromising our efficacy. And so when you think about RAM and CPU usage, like our RAM footprint's about 40 megabytes. So that's pretty darn tiny. Our disk space footprint is also very tiny at about 50 megabytes. And that's even up from, that used to be like several megabytes, but we've added some things, and certainly systems today versus 10 years ago, having a 50 megabyte footprint as opposed to a 5 isn't a big deal. But if you look at a lot of our competitors, it's several hundred megabytes to a gigabyte and beyond. Also, scan time CPU should be very low, like 25% or less. And again, it kind of depends on the system, but if you're on a heavily taxed system, these things can make more of a difference. But we actually have lots of Passmark. We've used Passmark for the last several years, but we do a comparison just to look at overall performance. And again, this isn't efficacy. This is system impact, and that can really make a big difference depending on how your environment is. If you're heavily virtualized and you're running several environments off of one server, disk space can add up. So yeah, performance is something that we continue to focus on. All right, I got one more question. Okay, so how are known versus unknown files determined? Is it MD5 hashes? If a file is acting malicious and it takes 30 minutes to be actually discovered, can it do it? Can it do a lot of damage in 30 minutes like ransomware? And so that's a great question. And so we actually use MD5 hashes, but our primary is SHA-256. This is really largely for legacy support. And it's true. 30 minutes. And sometimes it's less than 30 minutes, but I mean, we get through the vast majority of our pool in under 30 minutes, which I'm proud of. And yes, sometimes ransomware is there. And in these cases, you're right. Like that's an infection that if we fail, just like any other vendor, if we really fail at this, there's not a lot that can be done, if we figured out 30 minutes later, other than preventing some other user from encountering the same ransomware. And so our tool set's quite good to give us, variant detection. So when we see one variant of ransomware, and normally it's new, and we will detect and block and prevent several others before we then see another pivot that we have to modify something to now block. So yes, ransomware is a challenge. We do have some new technology in our stack that focuses, exclusively on like the techniques that we see. Sorry about that again. That we see ransomware use. But again, these things are like, the cat and mouse kind of tactics, and You know, if there was a silver bullet way to prevent it, you would have seen it in the market already. But the reality is you know, ransomware is still a challenge, and as best as we can be at still preventing it, we always advocate for having some data backup in place, and so you're not put in a position where you have to pay a ransom. But again, you know, we care very much about efficacy and are constantly looking at ways that we can improve. So. So yeah, okay, cool. Guys, I can't tell you how much I really appreciate you sticking with me for this entire hour and listening to all the content. This was a lot of fun to present today. And so I know, I believe tomorrow you guys will see an email with a recording. So, and also feel free to reach out. I think I have one more. Here we go. You can reach out to Webroot. You can also reach out to me, gmilbourne@gmail.com, at opentext.com. Sorry, that's my personal there. Yeah, and I'd be happy to, like, if I didn't touch on a question that you had, I'd be happy to follow up and give you my best shot at an answer. So again, everybody, appreciate your time and have a great rest of your day.